Hi, welcome to my video on fault systems and fault interactions. Although we often think about plate motions, plates moving past each other on one fault, for example, the San Andreas fault. In fact, plate motion is usually accommodated by a system of different types of faults at different orientations that are working together to accommodate that plate motion. So in this video, we're going to first give an overview of what we mean by systems of faults. Then we're going to talk about a simple example, which is stepovers and strike-slip faults. Then we'll talk about slip displacement and linkage between normal faults. We'll talk about partitioning of displacement and slip between thrust faults and folds. And we'll finish with a few slides thinking about implications for earthquakes and seismic hazard. So let's start with an example from New Zealand. Here in New Zealand, we have the Pacific Plate moving westward at about 40 millimeters per year in the direction shown by these red arrows. And it's crashing into the Australian plate here. So this is the plate boundary coming through here. In the north, we see this is actually a subduction zone. The Pacific Plate dives right down beneath the Australian plate in the Hikurangi subduction zone. However, as that plate boundary rolls around to be more parallel to the plate motion, we see it turns into a system of strike-slip faults, eventually even the Alpine Fault, one of the most famous strike-slip faults in the world. As it rolls back to a north-south orientation, we get another subduction zone, but this time the Australian plate is actually diving down beneath the Pacific Plate. So it's a single plate boundary between two plates, but the motion is accommodated by a whole system of different faults. And in particular, we see a lot of complexity in what are called transfer zones, where we're kind of transitioning from one type of fault, a subduction zone, to another type, a strike-slip fault. So we're going to explore these different systems of faults and transfer zones as we go ahead. So one of the simplest examples comes from stepovers in strike-slip faults. So strike-slip faults are vertical faults, and the blocks are moving laterally past each other, so they're not really moving up or down. So if we look at that in map view, this is the trace of a right lateral fault. So this side's coming this way, this side's coming this way. If this fault steps over, or if one fault ends and another one picks up, the area in between experiences relative extension as shown by these orange arrows, right? This block's trying to go this way, this block's trying to go this way. So if you force it to have a plate boundary, that's a different orientation, this becomes extensional. So what do we get there? We get a series of extensional faults, right? And so in 3 dimensions, that looks something like this. As the stepover occurs, we get a bunch of blocks that are essentially being pulled down in an extensional motion. We often call this a flower structure if it's kind of on the scale of a single fault. So if we step over in the opposite direction, we get the opposite effect. This is called a restraining bend or a transpressional stepover. Because this time as the fault steps, the intervening area is experiencing compression as shown by the orange arrows. So in this case, we also get a positive flower structure where essentially have a little bunch of thrust faults that are popping blocks up and also experiencing some strike-slip motion. All right, so in summary, that was a trans-tensional stepover or a trans-pressional stepover. So let's see a real-life example. This is a San Andreas fault down by the Mexican border in the Salton Sea area. We see the San Andreas as a right lateral fault, comes in here, takes a step, and continues as what's called the imperial fault, which then steps over and continues as what's called the Cerro Prieto fault. So each of these stepovers ends up being a releasing bend or a trans-tensional stepover, and we get extension in the stepover. And these little red lines show lots of extensional faults in this area. So indeed, those extensional faults are creating a lot of seismicity here in what's called the Brawley seismic zone at the southern end of the Salton Sea. So now let's move on to normal faults. So recall that normal faults form under extension. So the crust is being pulled apart as shown by these pink arrows. And here we have a bunch of normal faults where the hanging walls have dropped down relative to the foot walls. And what we see is that these normal faults, they have areas of large displacement, and then they kind of peter out and they transition over to another normal fault. This one peters out and transitions to another normal fault. So we have a system of faults that are connected by transfer zones. In this case, some of them have relay ramps like this. Some of them have more complex faulting in a transfer zone. And whatever the scale, whatever the type of faulting, it tends to be very complex in transfer zones because the stresses are very complex. Here's what that looks like in real life. We have a bunch of these fault scarps, and these are actually on what's called the Bishop Tableland in this example. This is a humongous rhyolite, eruptive rhyolite flow, and it's been extended, and it's broken into all of these different extensional faults which kind of overlap with each other. And here's a relay ramp, for example. Here's what that looks like from the air. We've got the essentially the Mono Lake caldera up here. Here's the whole tableland, and then here's all these faults cutting up and down it. You can see they go in both directions. Some are east facing, others are west facing, and they tend to overlap each other a lot. So one idea is that the total extension across this whole tableland is given by the sum of the displacements across all of these individual faults. And let's look at how those individual faults work in practice. So one very important idea is that fault displacement is almost always highest in the middle of the fault. So as a fault grows here at time 1, time 2, and time 3, we see that displacement increasing. And as that displacement is increasing, the fault is also growing longer. So this means that faults grow in a self-similar way. If you want to have more displacement, you need to make the fault longer. And moreover, whenever you have a fault, we always expect that the largest displacement to be near the center, tapering off to no displacement at the end, kind of by definition. However, as we just saw with the Bishop Tableland, because some faults die off and others pick up where they left off, we can actually sum the displacement across lots of different faults to get kind of the total displacement field. So this shows a map of individual fault segments on the tableland. That's A, B, C, and D in red. And then these blue areas show the total displacement on each of those segments. So here's A peaking in the middle and tailing off. Then B picks up, peaks in the middle and tails off. C picks up, peaks in the middle and tails off. If you sum the displacement on all these segments, you get this kind of light green envelope here. And so what we see is that the sum of them all also actually sums to this kind of arc shape with maximum displacement in the middle. And that may be because all these little faults are connecting at depth to a single master fault that also has this kind of characteristic displacement gradient as we come across it. So just to summarize here, the key takeaway is that there's a strong relationship between fault length and total displacement. And that goes not only for normal faults shown in blue, but also for thrust faults shown in red, and possibly for strike-slip faults shown in black. So here's that maximum displacement, and here's fault length. Each of these dots is an individual fault. So we see the longer the fault gets, the more the total displacement becomes. So let's transition a bit and talk about thrust faults now. This is a complex system of thrust faults from the Osler fault zone in New Zealand. And what we can see in this map up here, we have one thrust coming through here in white. It actually transitions to another thrust here also in white. And that transition is marked by a series of transfer faults. And each of these faults has a growing anticline fold behind it, shown in these black lines. So you can also see that here in the picture. Here's the anticline running in behind, here's the transfer faults, and then here's this other major thrust tip here in the foreland. So again, if you, in this study, they summed the displacement from folding, and they summed it with the total displacement from faulting, and you can see that on the right-hand side, the displacement on the fault dominates. That's this white line. That's in blue here. But then as you come across, we get a larger proportion of that taken up by folding, especially as this white fault dies. So again, the key message here is that we have multiple faults as well as folding and a transition zone, and we have to sum them all together to understand the total shortening across this area. So let's switch now to talking a little bit about implications for earthquakes and seismic hazards. So this diagram shows cumulative slip in an earthquake or along a fault in an earthquake event. So here's distance along the fault. So for example, if you look at this green event, it slipped this much here, slipped a little less here, and then it slipped tapered to nothing here. And so the important idea here is that if we need to accommodate a total convergence rate or a total shortening rate between two plates, we might expect the entire fault to actually need to kind of catch up and accommodate that same amount of shortening over time. So if we get one earthquake event on part of the fault or a nearby fault that accommodates this much slip, we might expect that the next event is going to kind of catch up. And you're going to next expect an event out here where you can kind of have a different pattern of slip that's going to catch up that part of the fault or that nearby segment. So this is also the idea of loading. If you have a lot of slip in an earthquake on one part, one fault segment, we may then expect the nearby fault segment to rupture soon and accommodate, catch up with that slip deficit. Another consideration for seismic hazard is that transfer zones or fault stepovers can also act as barriers to earthquake rupture and essentially prevent the fault or a fault system from rupturing further along strike, which can lead to less displacement and smaller earthquake events. So let's return to our example of the southern San Andreas here. Remember, the San Andreas comes down here, has a trans-tensional step over onto the Imperial Fault, then another trans-tensional step over onto the Cerro Prieto Fault. So we have these step overs are dividing the San Andreas into segments. And sure enough, if we look at past earthquakes, we have 1934 on the Cerro Prieto, which only ruptured this section, but may actually have loaded the Imperial Fault, the Imperial section, which then ruptured in 1940. And we are now waiting for this section of the San Andreas to rupture. But the key idea here is that if the fault had not been stepping over, this might have been one through-going rupture, creating more displacement, longer fault, and a much bigger earthquake. And I'll finish by pointing out that the same way longer faults can accommodate more displacement over long time scales, we also expect that longer faults can accommodate more instantaneous displacement during earthquakes. And that is shown by this compilation from faults in Asia, where you see as fault gets longer, the max displacement during earthquakes also goes up. So in summary, we see that different faults and different fault segments can work together to accommodate plate motion. Faults tend to be connected by transfer zones, stepovers, or relays, and those areas tend to be very complex. For any single fault or fault segment, displacement it tends to be higher near the center of the fault and lower at the tails. Likewise, we see higher maximum displacement for longer faults. And if we're concerned with understanding the whole amount of regional shortening or regional extension, we need to sum all of the faults, the folds, as well as tilting. And finally, fault segments and fault stepovers have an important control on the total length of earthquake ruptures and thus the total displacement and thus the total size of earthquakes. Thanks for listening.